realized that I was on mute. Sorry about that. Just wanted to join since everyone else is on. I just wanted to welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining and taking the time to join us today. Really quick, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Kara Senagaroon with the Halt the Harm Network, and co-moderating with me today is Robbie Disu with Stop the Fractivist. So just going to go through a couple of housekeeping notes and guidelines for today before we get started. Today's discussion is going to be recorded, and we will be sharing that with all the registrants and the attendees. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, make sure to chat Don Artiaga, one of our teammates, in the chat box in the bottom part of your control panel. So that should be on the right side of your screen if you're joining it by computer. And you can also just email info@halttheharm.net with any questions and your contact info during the webinar. We have someone will get back to you in touch just to help you troubleshoot, and that will be as soon as possible. And last but not least, we have a very short survey at the end of the webinar to get in touch with you and to get any feedback that you might have. And we want to just make sure to share it with our team and the panelists as well. So the webinar will start off with our panelists who will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and we'll have a Q&A at the end to really get some feedback from you guys if you have any additional questions and really get a chance to ask the panelists anything about their presentation. To ask the moderator a question or the panelists, or if you're having technical difficulties, you can use the question chat box. As you can see on the right-hand side, to send a message to us. And because we have quite a few people joining today, you won't be able to ask your question yourself, but we will be monitoring the questions chat box the entire time, and you can ask any question that you might have that we can get to at the end. So on to today's speakers. We're super lucky to have 4 panelists with us today. We have Steve Horn from G-Smog Blog, Jesse Coleman from Greenpeace, Maya Van Rossum from Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and Ellen Taylor from Beyond Extreme Energy. A little bit about Halt the Harm to start off. Halt the Harm is an emerging advocacy network that's designed to connect, serve, and support the dedicated individuals like yourselves working to halt the harms caused by fracking. The network's goal is really to expand and strengthen the base of leaders and supporters of the movement and facilitate collaboration among them to solve problems and share ideas. Ultimately, the network aims to equip leaders with the tools and strategies that they need to halt the harms of fracking in communities across the country. Now, who are the leaders of Halt the Harm? Leaders in the network are individuals actively working and collaborating to help those living in communities negatively impacted by fracking. A leader can really be anyone from, a director at a large national nonprofit, but also could be for example, a concerned parent who's organizing other parents at their school against local drilling. Leaders are able to access free resources and services online, like you can see our leader directory here, where you can email others directly or follow them on social media, campaign strategy and support, webinars like this one, and the Help Center, a hotline and TV ad campaign that we piloted in Pennsylvania. We're also working on developing a crowdfunding support service and a map of fracking-related litigation this year, so that's coming soon. And these are just some of the things that we're working on this year, but we're always looking for ideas and suggestions from individuals such as yourself. Some of you listening today may already be a leader, but if you're not one yet, you're definitely in luck. By registering for this webinar, you apply to be a leader, and look out for an email from me in the next week or so, and I'm happy to talk to you personally about any questions that you might have. So now I'll hand it over to Robbie to talk a little bit about Stop the Frack Attack.
Hi, everyone. This is Robbie. I'm the national coordinator for the Stop the Frack Attack network. We're a national network of 136 groups from around the country. We're made up of small grassroots groups of 2 to 3 folks and the big national groups like the Sierra Club, NRDC, Earthworks, and Food and Water Watch. What we do is we work to create greater collaboration in the anti-fracking movement. And we do so by bringing frontline voices to the proverbial decision-making table. And at that table, we look to bring resources into grassroots communities and frontline communities so they have the skills and the needs and the resources they need to fill the world that we are trying to fill. So that's a little bit about Stop the Frack Attack. many of you probably have come to our conferences. Our last one was in Denver, and we're looking to do another one next year in 2017, possibly somewhere near you. So that's SCFA, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Steve Horan. He is a freelance investigative journalist. He's works with DSmog blog and previously worked for the Center for Media and Democracy, and is currently a contributing editor for Counterpunch magazine and Nouveau, a all-weekly newspaper in Indianapolis. Take it away, Steve.
Thanks, and actually, thanks for having me on this webinar. Second of all, this presentation is actually going to be made jointly with Jesse Coleman of Greenpeace USA. So, if you want to just introduce him too before we get started, because he's actually going to lead it off.
Yeah, totally. Jesse works with Greenpeace USA on the investigations team. His research tracks the corporate funding of people and political groups that deny climate change is science. His work's been featured in The Guardian, The New York Times, The Colbert Report, and NPR, and many, many other places.
Thanks for that, Robbie, and hello, everybody. Really good to be here, to be talking to y'all. So today, Steve and I are going to unveil, really for the first time, an investigation that we've been working on for over a year, and it's an investigation into a little-known lobbying group that masquerades as a government agency, and it's called the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. And it's one of the most powerful shadow lobby groups you've never heard of. One of the reasons you might not have heard of them is that extremely boring and innocuous name, which has provided great camouflage for this group, as they have really laid the groundwork as far as regulation and exemptions for the current problems that we have with fracking and shale drilling. So you can see from the slide, the first slide here, this is actually a satellite picture of the grounds of the governor's mansion in Oklahoma City. You can see that this group is actually located in a cutout of the Oklahoma governor's mansion grounds, blocks from the Capitol, and just a short walk to the governor's mansion there. So next slide, please. So what is this group, and what do they do, and why are they important? Steve and I both separately stumbled on this group because they actually created Frack Focus, which many industry-funded and industry-created database of fracking chemicals. It's voluntarily, of course, participated in, and it has been found to really be lacking as far as disclosure. This group actually runs that. So they were actually founded in 1935. A state compact is a strange thing, and that's what this is. The Constitution of the United States says that two states can't enter into an agreement without the permission of Congress. And so state compacts are usually pretty regular things, like there's a state compact for your driver's license, for example. This is a very unique case. No other state compact really functions like this particular group does. Because they function really more as a lobbying arm for the oil and gas industry. So the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission is made up of the 30 oil and gas producing states in the United States, plus 6 Canadian provinces that produce oil and gas. The membership is either appointed by the governors of one of these 30 states, or is a industry executive or lobbyist that has signed up for membership with this group. Basically, what this group does is they get state oil and gas regulators, the people that are in charge of, all of Texas's drilling, all of Oklahoma's drilling, all of Pennsylvania's drilling, the government agency in charge of that. They get those heads together alongside lobbyists and executives from the oil and gas industry, and together they write legislation and they write regulations, much like the American Legislative Exchange Council does, if you've ever heard of that, ALEC. They write model resolutions twice a year at these very fancy and sort of getaway conferences, and then the state regulators take these back and recommend that their states pass these laws written in part by the oil and gas industry. So next slide. So here you can see these are actually pictures that we took from one of these conferences. You can see that Range Resources, large fracking company, sponsors their breakfast. You can see people mixing and mingling over drinks in that center picture. And then you can see the actual funders of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission on the right side. This is a very strange thing. You have an organization, the IOGCC, which actually claims to be a government agency that is fully funded, well, mostly funded, by the very oil and gas companies that they are supposed to be regulating. Next slide. So, obviously, this group has a very long history, and that history is very checkered. They're actually called a lobbyist organization way back in 1978 by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice said, you shouldn't be a state compact anymore. You shouldn't be called an agency. You should have the same oversight that other lobbying groups do. Because, and this is the really key part here, the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission does not declare any lobbying, does not pay any taxes, does not declare any of their sponsorship or contributions from the oil and gas industry, and is a completely closed box to us. They're not registered as a nonprofit because they call themselves a government agency, but they don't respond to Freedom of Information Acts or any kind of record request when you ask them, because they say they're suddenly not a state agency. So they're in this gray zone that allows them to be completely opaque. And the Department of Justice had a problem with that in 1978 and said that they should not be reauthorized. However, that was, as far as our investigation has found, that was mostly just forgotten about and ignored. And today, this organization exists in a gray state where Congress doesn't have to authorize them, and they don't have to release any of their information to the public. Next slide.
This is Steve chiming in here. Yeah, just to explain what these documents are real quick, because Jesse explained it very well already. But long and short, these are some of the documents that we obtained. None of these documents are obtained from the Freedom of Information or from IOGCC itself directly. We had to go many other ways to get stuff from IOGCC, whether it was from historical archives, whether it was from records requests to these state agencies, whether it was through interlibrary loan at random university libraries across the country, even around the world. Some of this stuff is actually housed in Germany. Through every way that we could, we've gathered documentation of how they have gotten this it's not, how have they existed since the 19 days, despite the fact they came under Department of Justice investigation. And the long story short of it was that, yes, they came under investigation, but the AG, the assistant AG at the time, as you'll see in the next slide, wrote in a letter to a congressman who is actually still around now, Philip Sharp. He works at Resources for the Future. I think he might head it up. Basically, they were asking what should we as Congress do about the IOGCC. So this was in response to a letter he wrote. Basically, this assistant attorney general said that more or less they can exist, but they should not have congressional blessing, as you'll see as you see in this slide, actually. So it's sort of a nebulous state in which they exist. Congress hasn't touched it since, and the public hasn't really paid attention, which is probably exactly as we've actually seen in documents, this is what IOGCC wanted. Next slide. Quickly, basically the way to understand IOGCC is one second. Yeah, Jesse, I'm hearing an echo too. Sorry, everyone who's listening. Okay, the way to understand IOGCC is as a counterforce to the regulations that were set up in the 1970s for extractive industries, whether it's the oil and gas industry, whether it's the coal industry, etc. Since the dawn of these regulations, we've learned that the IOGCC has been front and center in the oil and gas sphere in the United States to counter these regulations, whether it's the Safe Drinking Water Act, whether it's the Resource Recovery and Conservation Act, whether it's NEPA, which is considered the Magna Carta of environmental law. All of these fundamental safeguards, regulatory safeguards, IOGCC has fought very hard against. Very hard to learn this, though. We had to dig through historical archives again. We had to dig through electronic web resources from libraries, etc. So what will come next is just an explanation, sort of a depiction of how IOGCC actually works in action and what its impact has been. Next slide. So there will be two main case studies. This is not exhaustive. This is only two of many things that have been behind over the past, again, several decades. But I think the most interesting one to Jesse and I is probably this issue with what we understand in the United States as what's called the Halliburton loophole. It actually has a different hidden history, and behind that is the IOGCC. Starting in the 1970s, literally after the year that the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed, IOGCC was already working to carve out an exemption for the oil and gas industry, so that the oil and gas industry didn't have to comply with the dictates of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we saw through documents that, if you look at this on the right, this is the draft environmental impact statement for underground injection control program of the EPA. One of the quote-unquote interested parties who was commenting on that was the Interstate Oil Commission, which was called IOCC at the time. Gas got booked in the early 1990s. We see in the early 1980s another organization that IOGCC works with quite often, including on Frack Focus. Groundwater Protection Council was formed in the same city, in Oklahoma City. And at the time, it was called the Underground Injection Practices Council, but they had to greenwash their name the next half decade, and they called themselves the quote-unquote Groundwater Protection Council. So together, they worked very hard on the Safe Drinking Water Act issue and the exemption. Next slide.
And just a fun fact, the Groundwater Protection Council was actually formed to protect oil from groundwater, not to protect groundwater from oil. So.
And so, the more modern origins of this and the fracking issue, which is what brought us into this whole IRGCC situation to begin with, is a really important precedent-setting case called Leaf v. EPA. And IOGCC fought very hard against Leaf v. EPA. I'm just going to fly through this part. You'll see more about this on DSWOG and Greenpeace at a later date. But next slide. Basically, Leaf v. EPA was a case over whether or not the EPA should regulate underground injection and horizontal drilling and fracking as something that the oil and gas industry should have to comply with. The case ended in a middle ground, so IOGCC kept fighting, and more or less the next several years ended up getting what we now know as the Halliburton loophole passed through the Energy Policy Act 2005. But as we've seen, this is something that IOGCC was working on for decades before then. And I won't get into all the machinations in this presentation, but you'll see them at a later date. Next slide. And so, this is the playbook for IOGCC. It's through different news releases, press releases, lobbying Congress. They had a Washington, D.C. representative. They wrote letters to the EPA. You can see those in the docket. All the different tactics they've utilized. It's classic lobbying and advocacy, but with none of the accountability. Very hard to find a lot of these facts out. A lot of these press releases I found are not even online anymore. They're on the web archive. Some of them came from historical archives, but they basically buried this history in the closet. Next slide. Again, more documents. Next slide. And then, the thing that brought us to the one thing that was online was this newsletter that Jesse and I both located, which is the September 2005 newsletter. Right after the Energy Policy Act 2005 passed, you see this headline in the newspaper saying, "Look, IOGCC's legislative fix for hydraulic fracturing passed." So they're not calling it the Halliburton loophole. They're calling it their loophole. And then in this newsletter, they give an entire history of how they did it, starting with the Leaf v. EPA. Effort back in the 1990s. Next slide. So this one I'm going to go through even faster. This is a preview of an article that's coming out in DSWOG. But there's a bill that I referenced called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And this opened the door for lots of issues that the United States is facing now: earthquakes from fracking, the methane leakage in pipelines, waste dumping of oil and gas waste. All of this was more or less one of the roots of it is this exemption that the industry got, just like the Halliburton loophole, to enforcement of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, calling their waste not solid waste, carving out a small exemption within that bill and working very hard on it. So the same exact playbook was carried out, and now we have these issues again that we're dealing with. So a long story short, just like with the Safe Drinking Water Act, there was a key congressional staffer that IRGCC befriended. This was a person who is now still influential in the oil and gas sphere. His name is Lee Fuller. He is one of the chief lobbyists for the Independent Petroleum Association of America, which created the Fracking Front Group Energy in Depth. Back then, later it would be, with the Halliburton loophole, it was a guy named Bill Cooper, who ended up becoming a lobbyist for the American Petroleum Institute, created a center for liquefied natural gas, and he's now went back through the revolving door, and he heads up a key committee that deals with energy in the House of Representatives. So that's part of the tactic. They befriend people in Congress and get stuff they want passed. Next slide. And I won't go through all these details. You'll see it in the article that's coming out. It should come out early next week. But they had friends in the EPA, Don Clay, who ended up working for Koch Industries as a lobbyist after he left the EPA. So that was another